At my son's first wedding anniversary, my daughter-in-law raised the microphone, looked straight at me, and said, "Who let you in? People like you don't belong here." 300 guests turned as my son leaned close and whispered, "Mom, please leave. You're embarrassing me." I smiled, set my purse on the table, and walked toward the exit. Then the ballroom doors burst open. A man shouted, and the smile on my daughter-in-law's face slowly vanished. This story starts quietly, but it won't leave you unchanged. Before we continue, drop a comment and tell me, have you ever been made to feel invisible by people who thought they were better than you? Your voice matters here. Quick note, some details are adapted for storytelling, but the core message is what I hope stays with you. The phone buzzed on my ironing board just as I pressed the collar of my blue dress flat. Celeste's anniversary post had 32 photos of 300 guests, and I counted every face twice searching for mine. At 67, I had spent 3 decades cleaning offices where powerful men made decisions, my worn hands pushing a vacuum across marble floors, while my sharp mind cataloged numbers that didn't add up. The steam hissed against the cotton fabric, the same blue dress I'd worn to church for 8 years, still presentable if you didn't look too close at the hem. The caption glowed on my phone screen, "Our first anniversary celebrating with our loved ones." I scrolled through the photos. Celeste Whitmore appeared in every frame, 32 and elegant in designer silk. Her smile, perfect. Her mother-in-law erased from every caption. My son Silas stood beside his wife, 35 and polished in his tailored suit, smiling at 300 guests while I ironed a dress, alone in my Queens apartment on 43rd Street. I kept scrolling. Photo number 17 made me stop. Merritt Blackwell stood near the bar, 60 and steel-eyed, wearing a dark suit. I knew that face. I knew exactly why Preston Whitmore's business rival had been invited to his daughter's anniversary party. And I knew, with the certainty of someone who'd spent 18 months preparing, that Merritt wasn't surprised my name had been left off the guest list. I looked at the photo one last time. Then I set the phone down and picked up the iron. After 18 months, I was done being invisible. The dress took another 10 minutes. I hung it on my bedroom door, smoothed the collar one final time, then put it on, clipped my purse shut, and called a taxi. By the time the cab arrived, the September evening had settled into that particular Manhattan twilight, where the sky turns violet and streetlights flicker on. I climbed into the back seat and gave the driver the address, Lucien's Grand Ballroom, Midtown. I watched Queens slide past the window bodegas with hand-painted signs, laundromats with neon open signs, buzzing apartment buildings where families like mine had lived for generations before being priced out. I thought about March 2022, 18 months ago, a Thursday night close to midnight when I was cleaning the 12th floor offices at the Whitmore Foundation building. Someone had left files open on the chief accountant's desk. I wasn't snooping. The papers were just there. One invoice caught my eye, $340,000, transferred to Meridian Care Solutions, LLC, for medical equipment delivery. No delivery address, no item codes, just the amount and the company name. I remembered the numbers because numbers are a language I understand. I've been keeping books for small shops in Queens on weekends for years, catching the kinds of mistakes honest people make and the kinds of errors dishonest people hope nobody notices. This wasn't a mistake. The next morning, I stopped at the 99-cent store and bought a small, blue-covered notebook. I wrote down the date, the amount, the company name. Then I went home and went back to work that night like nothing had changed. But everything had changed. Do you know what a number looks like when it's wrong? Not incorrect wrong, like a heartbeat skipping, like a word misspelled in your own name. That's what I saw every time I cleaned that office. More invoices, more shell companies, more money disappearing. For 16 months, I documented everything. I took no files, I broke no locks, I only wrote down what was left open. By July 2023, my notebook had 163 pages of careful handwriting, and I had 847 pages of photocopied receipts from the trash bins. That's when I contacted Merritt Blackwell. His grandson had died 3 years earlier. 8 years old, leukemia. The Whitmore Foundation had promised treatment funds and then delayed until the boy was gone. Merritt had spent 3 years trying to prove the foundation was corrupt, but he'd never had evidence. Until I walked into his office in July and set my blue notebook on his desk. He stared at it for a long time. Then he said, "Mrs. Warren, if this is what I think it is, we can bring them down. Every last one." I told him the truth. I didn't do it for revenge, Mr. Blackwell. I did it because the numbers were wrong. But I didn't tell him the whole truth. I didn't tell him about my son's name on 3 offshore accounts he'd never opened. I didn't tell him about the plan to make Silas the scapegoat. I didn't tell him I'd waited 18 months because I needed enough evidence to prove my son didn't know. The taxi crossed the Queensboro Bridge. I pressed my palm against the window, watching Manhattan rise ahead. The city I'd cleaned for 30 years, the city that never once asked my name. Tonight, the notebook I bought for 99 cents would cost the Whitmores $47 million. Tonight, my son would see exactly who his wife really was. And tonight, Merritt Blackwell would walk into that anniversary party with 847 pages of evidence already verified by federal prosecutors. Tonight wasn't about confrontation. It was about execution. The taxi stopped in front of Lucien's grand ballroom, all crystal and gold lights spilling onto the sidewalk. I looked at the glass doors and saw my reflection, an old woman in a blue dress from 2015 holding a small purse, standing outside a party that cost more than I'd earned in a decade. I smiled, because they had no idea that the woman they'd forgotten to invite was the only one in that building who knew exactly how tonight would end. The crystal chandelier in Lucien's lobby threw light across 300 guests in silk and wool. And when I stepped through the doors in my blue cotton dress from 2015, I felt every eye that didn't bother to look up. The marble floor clicked under my worn flats. A string quartet played something classical near the coat check. The air smelled like expensive perfume and fresh roses, the kind of roses that cost more per stem than I spent on groceries in a week. The reception desk stood 15 feet ahead, all gilt and marble, staffed by a woman in her mid-30s with a practiced smile and a tablet that glowed against her black blazer. I walked toward her the same way I'd walked into the Whitmore Foundation offices every night for 6 years. Steady, unremarkable, invisible. "Good evening," she said. Her nameplate read, "Lauren Hayes. Welcome to the Whitmore Warren Anniversary Celebration. May I have your name?" Maxine Warren. Her fingers moved across the tablet screen, scrolling. Her smile tightened at the corners. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but I don't see your name on the list. May I ask who invited you?" "My son, Silas Warren. This is his anniversary party." Lauren's face did something careful. Not surprise recognition. She glanced at the tablet again, and I saw it the way her eyes caught on something, the way her jaw shifted, like she'd just confirmed an instruction she'd hoped wasn't real. Let me just call inside to confirm. If you could wait here, please." She stepped back from the podium phone already at her ear, voice dropping to a murmur I wasn't meant to hear. I stood there in the lobby with my small purse and my blue dress and the weight of 300 guests flowing past me toward the ballroom entrance. A couple in their 50s brushed past the woman's diamond bracelet catching the light. 2 men in tailored suits laughed about something near the bar. Nobody looked at me. Nobody stopped. That's when I understood. Celeste hadn't forgotten to add my name to the guest list. She had deleted it. And Lauren Hayes, standing 12 feet away with the phone pressed to her ear and her eyes carefully avoiding mine, had been told exactly what to do if anyone named Warren showed up without an invitation. I waited. Across the lobby near the entrance to the main ballroom, Merritt Blackwell stood, holding a glass of scotch. 60 years old, steel-eyed, wearing a dark suit that fit him the way power fits men who've earned it the hard way. He caught my gaze and gave the smallest nod, not greeting confirmation. He'd been waiting for me. Lauren returned to the podium, her smile now edged with something that looked like pity. "Mrs. Warren, you're all set. Please go right in." I walked past her without saying thank you. She hadn't done me a favor. She'd just been overruled. The ballroom opened before me like a photograph from a magazine I'd never be able to afford. 5 crystal chandeliers, tables draped in cream silk, a stage at the far end where a 5-tier cake stood gleaming under spotlights. 300 people in designer clothes, holding cocktails, laughing. I had cleaned this building's 12th floor offices every Tuesday night for 6 years. The same building where Lucien's rented the ballroom, and not once had I walked through the front doors. I scanned the room. It took me 18 seconds to find my son. Silas stood near the bar with 4 men in suits, all of them holding drinks, all of them polished and confident in the way people are when they've never had to worry about the price of anything. My son fit right in. Tailored charcoal suit, silver cufflinks, hairstyled with product that probably cost $40. He looked exactly like his father used to look before the cancer took him. I walked toward him. The crowd shifted around me like water around a stone, polite and distant. I kept my eyes on Silas and watched the moment he saw me. For 1 second, 1 heartbeat, I saw the little boy who used to wait for me by the door when I came home from night shifts. The boy who'd wrap his arms around my waist and ask what I'd brought him from the vending machine. Then his face rearranged itself into something rigid. "Mom," his voice was quiet, controlled. I didn't know you were coming." Not a greeting, a warning. His colleagues shifted glasses, pausing halfway to mouths, eyes moving between us like spectators at an accident. "I brought you something," I said. I reached into my purse and pulled out the small wrapped box I'd prepared that morning. Blue paper, white ribbon, nothing expensive. Inside was a pocket watch that had belonged to his grandfather, my father, the only thing of value I'd ever inherited. I'd planned to give it to Silas on his 40th birthday, but tonight felt like the right time, the last time. I held it out. "Happy anniversary." Silas stared at the box like it was evidence. His hand moved slowly, reluctantly, and took it from me. The colleagues watched in silence. "You didn't have to." His voice trailed off. His eyes moved past me across the ballroom, and I knew without turning that he was looking at Celeste. Then back to his colleagues. Then down to the box in his hands. When does it happen, that moment when your child stops seeing you and starts seeing what other people think of you? I had worked 3 jobs to put Silas through college. I had sat in hospital waiting rooms when he had pneumonia at 9 years old, holding his hand while the IV dripped antibiotics into his veins. I had believed, even after he married into the Whitmore family, even after the invitations to Sunday dinners stopped coming, that somewhere inside the polished man in the tailored suit, my son still remembered who had raised him. But standing in that ballroom, watching him hold a gift he couldn't afford to acknowledge, I saw the calculation happen in real time. Silas glanced toward Celeste again. She stood near the stage 32 and radiant in ivory silk, surrounded by her father's business partners. Her eyes were already on us, watching. Then Silas looked at his colleagues, then at the box. I knew that look. I'd seen it on his face when he was 7 years old and had to choose between sitting with me in the school cafeteria or joining the popular kids at their table. He set the box down on the nearest cocktail table without opening it. And I knew, before Celeste ever took the microphone, that tonight my son had already made his choice. When Celeste took the microphone beside the 5-tier cake and said, "Thank you all for being here to celebrate with everyone who truly belongs," I was standing 20 feet away near the bar, and I heard the word belongs land like a stone. The ballroom had quieted the moment she'd stepped onto the small stage. 300 guests turned toward her, champagne glasses paused, mid-sip conversations trailing into silence. The spotlights made her ivory silk dress glow. She looked like something from a bridal magazine, perfect and untouchable. "Tonight is special," Celeste continued, her voice smooth and practiced. "Not just because Silas and I are celebrating our first year together, but because we're surrounded by the people who matter most. Our family, our partners, our friends." She gestured toward the head table where Preston Whitmore sat, silver-haired and watching. Then toward Silas, still standing near the bar with his colleagues, his face carefully blank. "Everyone here tonight," Celeste said, pausing for effect, "belongs at this table." There it was again. Belongs. Her eyes moved across the room, scanning, searching, and then they found me. I stood with my back to the bar, my blue dress from 2015 suddenly feeling like a uniform under stage lights. Celeste's smile didn't change, but something in her gaze sharpened. She lowered the microphone slightly, tilting her head. "Excuse me," she said, her voice still amplified, still heard by every person in the room. Who let you in? The ballroom went completely silent. No clinking glasses, no rustling fabric, no whispered conversation. Just 300 people turning to look at the woman in the worn blue dress standing alone by the bar. I didn't move. This wasn't the first time someone had asked me that question. I'd been asked it at parent-teacher conferences and schools where the other mothers wore pearls. I'd been asked it at hospital waiting rooms when I'd arrived in my cleaning uniform to sit with Silas after his tonsil surgery. I'd been asked it in 100 small ways by 100 people who looked at me and saw someone who didn't fit. But this was the first time someone had asked it into a microphone in front of 300 witnesses. Celeste was still smiling, waiting for an answer. I looked at her and thought about the offshore account in the Cayman Islands with her name on it. The shell company registered to her personal email address. The 16 invoices I'd photocopied from the trash bins on the 14th floor, each one showing transfers to Meridian Care Solutions, LLC, a company that existed only on paper and in her father's accounting ledgers. If you've never been asked who let you in while 300 strangers watch, let me tell you what it feels like. It feels like every year you spent invisible was by design. I opened my mouth to answer, but a voice cut through the silence first. I'll handle this, sweetheart. Preston Whitmore rose from the head table, 65 and silver-haired, in a charcoal suit moving with the ease of a man who'd spent 40 years ensuring every room knew exactly who held the power. He crossed to the stage, took the microphone from Celeste's hand, and patted her shoulder like she was a child who'd done well but needed the adults to finish. "Ladies and gentlemen," Preston said, his voice warm, fatherly, the kind of voice that made boardrooms lean in and believe. "Let me introduce you to Silas's mother." He didn't use my name. "She raised our boy." He paused, corrected himself with a small laugh. "Silas. Raised him alone, in fact. Admirable, truly. Single mother, working nights, making do. Some families work with what they have." A few guests made soft sounds of sympathy. One woman near the front table actually put her hand over her heart. Preston smiled at me across the ballroom, and it was the kind of smile that looked generous in photographs. "Tonight," he continued, "the Whitmore family is proud to be generous. We believe in lifting people up, in helping those who've struggled. But," he paused again, letting the word hang, "generosity has limits." Somewhere near the back, someone chuckled. A man in a gray suit holding a scotch, nodding, like Preston had just said something wise. I stood there and let Preston's words wash over me like water. He thought he was dismissing me. He thought he was putting me in my place, in front of his peers, his partners, his daughter's anniversary guests. He had no idea I'd spent 18 months standing in rooms just like this one, emptying trash bins that held evidence of every crime his foundation had committed. "We're all family here," Preston said, spreading his arms wide. "Some by blood, some by choice, some by," he glanced at me, "circumstance. So let's raise a glass to family, to love, to knowing our place." 300 glasses lifted. Preston handed the microphone back to Celeste, kissed her cheek, and returned to the head table. He sat down beside his daughter, adjusted his cufflinks, and reached for his wine glass. Satisfied, I looked at him from across the ballroom. 65 years old, silver-haired, wearing a suit that cost more than I earned in 3 months. And I thought about the number I'd written on page 1 of my blue notebook 18 months ago. $47,300,000. That's how much the Whitmore Foundation had stolen from medical funds meant for children with cancer families drowning in hospital bills, veterans who couldn't afford wheelchairs. $47,300,000 funneled through shell companies and offshore accounts, while Preston Whitmore sat on charity boards and accepted awards for philanthropic excellence. Our son-in-law, he'd said it earlier during his speech. Not Silas, not my son's name, our son-in-law, like ownership, like inventory, like my boy was an asset acquired through marriage, not a person. No one else had caught it. But I had. Preston Whitmore raised his wine glass to his lips, and the crystal caught the light from the chandelier overhead. He looked like a man who'd never made a mistake in his life, a man who'd built an empire on reputation and generosity and the belief that some people were welcome and some people weren't. I wondered how much longer he'd be able to smile like that. because across the ballroom near the entrance, Merritt Blackwell was setting down his scotch and reaching into his jacket pocket. My son crossed the silent ballroom in 6 steps. He stopped close enough for me to see the boy I'd raised somewhere behind his corporate smile, and then he said the only words I'd been dreading all night. "Mom, please, you're embarrassing me. Can you just leave?" He whispered it. Not because he was being kind, because he didn't want anyone else to hear. I looked at his face, 35 years old, clean-shaven, wearing cufflinks I'd never seen before, and tried to find the boy who used to hold my hand in parking lots, the 12-year-old who'd cried when his father died, the 18-year-old who'd promised he'd never forget where he came from. But the man standing in front of me wasn't looking at me. He was glancing past my shoulder, toward Celeste, toward Preston, toward the 300 guests who'd just watched his father-in-law mock the woman who'd raised him. "Silas," I said quietly. "Please, Mom, just go. I'll call you tomorrow." He still wouldn't meet my eyes. And that's when I understood. This wasn't about embarrassment. This wasn't even about loyalty. This was about survival. Silas had looked at the room and calculated the cost of defending me, and he decided I wasn't worth it. I thought about the offshore accounts with his name on them, the shell companies he'd never heard of, the plan Preston and Celeste had built to frame my son for every dollar they'd stolen. I'd spent 18 months documenting fraud because I'd believed my son deserved to be saved. But standing here listening to him ask me to leave, I realized something I should have known years ago. Some people don't want to be saved. They just want to be comfortable. "Okay," I said. I set my purse down on the nearest cocktail table. I didn't say another word. I just turned my back on my son and walked toward the exit. 1 step, 2, 3. The ballroom stayed silent. I could feel 300 pairs of eyes on my blue dress, on my worn flats, on the old woman who'd been publicly humiliated and was now leaving exactly the way Preston Whitmore had wanted. 4 steps. 5, 6. I counted every step toward that exit. At step 7, I realized I'd spent 35 years walking away from rooms that didn't want me. Parent-teacher conferences, hospital waiting rooms, church basements where other families never quite made space. This was the last time. 8, 9, 10. The exit doors were 15 feet ahead. I could already see myself on the sidewalk in the September cold, hailing a taxi back to Queens, back to my apartment on 43rd Street. 11, 12. I was 3 steps from the exit when the doors didn't open. They burst. Like thunder, like a wall coming down. Merritt Blackwell walked through first, 60 years old and moving like a man who just won a case he'd spent 3 years preparing. Behind him came 2 lawyers in dark suits, Marcus Fielding and Catherine Ross. And behind them, 3 federal agents, led by a woman I recognized from the photograph Merritt had shown me in July. Special Agent Dagny Thornton, 48 and unshakable in a charcoal blazer, walked 3 steps behind Merritt with the calm precision of someone who'd executed white-collar arrests in rooms far more hostile than this. Merritt crossed the ballroom floor in a straight line. Not toward Preston, not toward the head table, toward me. He stopped 6 feet away, and in front of 300 witnesses, he bowed his head slightly. "Mrs. Warren," he said, his voice carrying across the silent room, "thank you for coming tonight." I stood there, 3 steps from the exit, and said nothing. Merritt turned to face the ballroom. "Ladies and gentlemen, some of you know me, Merritt Blackwell. I've spent the last 3 years investigating the Whitmore Foundation after my grandson, 8 years old, leukemia, died waiting for treatment funds this foundation promised and then delayed until it was too late." The room stayed frozen. 6 months ago, Merritt continued, Mrs. Warren walked into my office with a notebook she'd bought for 99 cents and 847 pages of documentation showing exactly where those funds went. Shell companies, offshore accounts, fraudulent invoices, $47,300,000 stolen from families like mine. He gestured toward Agent Thornton. Federal agents have verified every page, every transaction, every signature. The ballroom erupted in whispers, low-shocked spreading like wildfire. I heard wine glasses being set down on tables, the scraping of chairs. Someone near the back said, "Oh my God," loud enough to carry. Merritt looked at me and smiled, not victory gratitude, and I understood. The timing hadn't been accidental. Merritt had watched me walk into this ballroom. He'd watched the receptionist try to turn me away. He'd watched Celeste humiliate me with a microphone. He'd watched Preston mock me. He'd watched my own son ask me to leave. He'd waited until I was 3 steps from the exit, until every person in this room had seen exactly how the Whitmores treated people they considered beneath them before walking through those doors. Because my vindication wasn't just about proving the fraud. It was about showing 300 witnesses that the woman they'd dismissed, the woman they'd ignored, the woman they'd watched walk toward the exit in a dress from 2015 had been the only person in this building who'd known the truth all along. I turned to look at my son. Silas stood frozen near the bar, his face pale, his colleagues stepping away from him like he'd just become radioactive. His eyes met mine for the first time that night, and I saw it, the realization, the understanding, the terrible, dawning comprehension that his mother, the woman he'd just asked to leave, had spent 18 months saving him from a crime he didn't even know he'd been framed for. I didn't smile. I didn't nod. I just looked at him, without needing to hide a single thing in my eyes. Because Merritt Blackwell had just told everyone in that room that I hadn't come here to beg. I'd come here to win. Preston Whitmore's voice cut through the ballroom like a knife through silk. This is absurd. 300 heads turned toward him. He stood from the head table, silver-haired and commanding in his charcoal suit, and suddenly he had the stage again, exactly where he'd spent 40 years winning arguments he had no business winning. He crossed the floor toward Dagny Thornton and Merritt Blackwell with the confidence of a man who'd talked his way out of corners since before I was born. His hands moved in practiced gestures, his voice projecting to every corner of the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," Preston said, addressing the crowd like he was still hosting the party, "I understand this looks dramatic. Federal agents, accusations. But let's be clear about what's actually happening here." He gestured toward me. "This woman is a cleaning lady. She's worked night shift at our foundation building for years, yes. But she has no financial training, no accounting background. She couldn't possibly understand the complex documents she claims to have seen." The room was silent listening. Preston turned to Dagny Thornton, his voice shifting to something that sounded almost sympathetic. "Agent Thornton, I respect your work, but you've been misled by someone with good intentions and zero expertise. The documents she's shown you, whatever they are, she's clearly misinterpreted sophisticated financial instruments she doesn't have the education to comprehend." Dagny Thornton stood completely still, her face expressionless. "Sir," she said calmly, "which documents are you referring to exactly?" Preston's hand froze mid-gesture. The question hung in the air like smoke. I watched him realize what he'd just done. His mouth opened slightly. His eyes moved from Dagny to Merritt to the laptop one of the federal agents was holding. Then back to Dagny. "The documents she claims." "Which specific documents?" Dagny asked again, her voice perfectly neutral. "You just stated that this woman has misinterpreted the documents she saw. I'm asking which documents you're referring to. We haven't yet specified what Mrs. Warren provided to our investigation." Preston's face went carefully blank. "Too late. In the eyes of the law, a second too late is a lifetime too late. Do you know what happens when a man who's never been told no realizes he just said the one thing he should never have said? He looks exactly like Preston Whitmore looked in that moment, frozen, calculating, searching for the words that would undo the last 30 seconds. But there are no words that can unsay what's already been heard by 300 witnesses and at least one federal agent who just watched him confirm he knew exactly which documents I'd accessed. Dagny turned to me. "Mrs. Warren, would you verify your identity and the materials you provided to Mr. Blackwell's legal team?" Merritt handed me the microphone. I held it the way I'd held mops and vacuum cleaners for 30 years. Steady. Practiced a tool designed for a job that needed doing. "My name is Maxine Warren," I said. "I live at 2847 43rd Street, Queens, New York. I've worked night shift cleaning and maintenance at the Whitmore Foundation building for 6 years. On July 14, 2023, I provided documentation to Mr. Blackwell's legal team showing financial irregularities I'd observed during my employment. My voice didn't shake. I wasn't nervous. I was stating facts the same way I'd stated facts to myself every night for 18 months, while I copied invoices from trash bins and wrote numbers in my blue notebook. Every invoice, I continued, every shell company, every offshore transfer, 18 months of records, documented in a notebook I bought for 99 cents at a corner store on my way to work. Dagny nodded to one of the agents. He opened a laptop and turned it toward the room. A projector screen descended from the ceiling. Someone had clearly prepared for this. And suddenly, the ballroom was filled with spreadsheets, columns of numbers, company names, transaction dates, bank routing codes. Every number I'd written down by hand now displayed in federal database format. The agent placed something on the white cloth table beside the laptop. My blue notebook. Small. Worn. The cover bent at one corner where I'd shoved it into my purse too quickly one night when a security guard had walked past the office I was cleaning. That blue notebook sat on the white tablecloth like a pebble that had just shattered a cathedral window. Small, simple, impossibly destructive. Dagny opened it, carefully turning pages filled with my careful handwriting. Dates, dollar amounts, company names. Every entry written in the same blue pen I'd used for 6 years to fill out my timesheets. She held one page up to the projector. March 18th, 2022. Meridian Care Solutions, LLC, $340,000. No delivery address, no item codes. The screen behind her showed the same transaction pulled from federal banking records. Every number matched. Dagny turned another page. May 2nd, 2022. Coastal Medical Equipment Holdings, $215,000. Wire transfer, Cayman Islands account. The screen updated. Perfect match. She turned another page, and another, and another. 18 months of transactions. 18 months of theft. 18 months of a cleaning lady writing down numbers while powerful men assumed she was too stupid to understand what she was seeing. Every single number matched the federal database perfectly. I looked across the ballroom at Celeste Whitmore, 32 years old, elegant in ivory silk, standing beside the 5-tier anniversary cake that had cost more than I earned in a month. She was staring at that tiny blue notebook lying open on the table, its pages filled with my handwriting next to the federal laptop displaying the stolen funds. All their power, all their money, all their connections, lawyers and accountants and politicians who owed favors. And the thing destroying it all was a notebook I'd bought for 99 cents. I saw the exact moment she understood that no lawyer in the world could argue with numbers that matched perfectly. Her face went pale. Not the pale of someone who's embarrassed, the pale of someone who's just realized the floor beneath them has disappeared. Preston stood frozen near Dagny Thornton, his mouth slightly open, his polished smile finally completely gone. And my son Silas stood near the bar with his colleagues, watching his mother verify 18 months of evidence that would destroy the family he'd married into and clear his name from the accounts he'd never opened. Dagny Thornton closed my notebook gently and set it back on the table. "Thank you, Mrs. Warren," she said. Then she reached for a second laptop. The portable screen lit up with a flowchart that looked like a spider web. 6 shell companies, 3 offshore banks, arrows showing money flowing from the Whitmore Foundation through the Cayman Islands, Liechtenstein, Singapore, and back into accounts controlled by Preston and Celeste Whitmore. Dagny Thornton stood beside the screen, reading from the federal report with the calm precision of someone who'd spent 20 years explaining exactly how wealthy people stole from the poor. 6 shell companies, she said, $47,300,000 over 4 years, routed through offshore accounts in 3 jurisdictions, then transferred back to personal accounts registered to Preston Whitmore and Celeste Whitmore. The ballroom was silent. Dagny turned a page. The shell companies include Meridian Care Solutions, LLC, Coastal Medical Equipment Holdings, Pacific Health Systems International, Northeast Pharmaceutical Supply Group, Atlantic Wellness Distribution, and Gibraltar Medical Resources. 6 names I'd written in my blue notebook. 6 companies that existed only on paper and in bank accounts, designed to hide money from people who needed it. Each company, Dagny continued, was created to receive funds designated for specific charitable purposes through the Whitmore Foundation. Medical equipment for underserved communities, treatment subsidies for uninsured patients, pharmaceutical assistance programs. She paused. None of those funds reached their intended recipients. I heard someone near the back of the room make a sound half gasp, half sob. A woman in a navy dress, probably someone who'd donated to the foundation herself, someone who'd believed the glossy brochures and the annual reports showing smiling children receiving care. Dagny turned another page, and her voice shifted to something harder. $2.1 million came from the Whitmore Foundation Pediatric Cancer Treatment Fund. Donations received between January 2021 and August 2023, designated specifically for children's oncology treatment costs that never reached a single hospital. The silence changed. It wasn't shock anymore. It was horror. I looked at the 5-tier cake standing on the stage, untouched, gleaming under spotlights. The flowers cascading down the ballroom walls, the crystal champagne flutes on every table, the string quartet that had played during cocktail hour. $380,000. That's what tonight's anniversary celebration had cost. I knew because I'd seen the invoice in the trash 3 weeks ago, the one from Lucienne's grand ballroom with the final payment receipt stapled to the top. $380,000 of stolen money. Money meant for children who'd never see their next birthday. Money meant for families choosing between chemotherapy and mortgage payments. Money meant for parents sitting in hospital waiting rooms at 3 a.m, praying for miracles they couldn't afford. If you've ever wondered what kind of people steal from children dying of cancer, let me tell you, they look exactly like the ones standing in that ballroom, in designer suits, holding champagne glasses, smiling for photographers at their daughter's anniversary party. Dagny closed the report and looked directly at Preston Whitmore. Mr. Whitmore, you've served as chairman of the Whitmore Foundation for 18 years. Every transaction I just described required authorization from the foundation's chief executive officer, a position you've held since 2005. Preston said nothing. Celeste stood beside the 5-tier cake, her ivory silk dress suddenly looking less like wedding elegance and more like a costume someone wore to hide who they really were. Dagny opened the second laptop. 3 offshore holding companies were created in February 2000, 26 months before Silas Warren married Celeste Whitmore. All 3 list the same registered managing director. She turned the screen toward the room. Warren Holdings, Cayman Limited. Warren Capital, Singapore. Warren Asset Trust, Liechtenstein. Registered Managing Director, Silas Michael Warren. My son stood near the bar, his face going pale in a way I'd only seen once, before the day his father died, and he'd realized he was alone in the world, except for me. I never signed, Silas started, his voice breaking. You signed everything I put in front of you, Silas. Celeste's voice cut through the ballroom like glass shattering. That wasn't her wife voice. That wasn't the voice that had said vows in front of 200 guests. That wasn't the voice that had called him honey and darling and made him believe he'd married into a family that valued him. That was the voice of someone who'd been acting for 4 years straight. That was the voice of the architect. You never read anything. Celeste continued, her eyes fixed on Silas, with the kind of cold precision I'd seen in loan officers denying mortgages and hospital administrators explaining why treatment wasn't covered. Every document I handed you, incorporation papers, banking authorizations, asset transfers, you signed them all without reading a single page. That's why I chose you. The ballroom fell into the kind of silence that happens when people realize they're watching something shatter in real time. Silas looked at his wife, the woman he'd trusted with every signature, every decision, every piece of his future, the woman who'd chosen him not because she loved him, but because he was easy to manipulate, because he wanted so desperately to be part of a family with money and power and connections that he'd sign anything she put in front of him without asking questions. Then he looked at me, and for the first time since he'd whispered, "Mom, please leave," the shame in his eyes wasn't about having a mother who cleaned offices for a living. It wasn't about being associated with someone who wore the same blue dress for 8 years. It wasn't about being seen with the woman Preston Whitmore had just mocked in front of 300 witnesses. The shame in his eyes was about being a man who'd never once asked what he was signing. A man who'd chosen comfort over courage, trust over truth, belonging over questioning. A man who'd spent 4 years married to someone who saw him as nothing more than a convenient scapegoat with the right last name. Before we continue, comment A if you think Silas knew what he was signing, or B if he was completely used, and tell me one reason why. Quick note, the next part includes fictionalized details to convey the emotional impact, but the lesson is what matters most. When Special Agent Dagny Thornton turned to me and asked, "Mrs. Warren, when did you first become aware of these discrepancies?" the entire ballroom went still, waiting to hear if I'd stumbled onto this last week or last month. And I let the silence hang for just long enough before I said what I'd been waiting 18 months to say out loud. March 2022. 2 words, a month and a year. But the way the room shifted told me everyone understood what those 2 words meant. 18 months ago. Not last week. Not last month. Not yesterday or the day before or even 6 months back when someone might have accidentally noticed something wrong and decided to be a good citizen. 18 months of knowing. 18 months of documenting. 18 months of watching Preston and Celeste Whitmore steal from dying children while I emptied their trash bins and vacuumed their office floors. March 2022, I repeated, my voice steady. A Thursday night, close to midnight. I was cleaning the chief accountant's office on the 12th floor. Someone had left files open on the desk. Dagny nodded, writing something in her notebook. Merritt Blackwell stepped forward. "Mrs. Warren contacted my legal team in July 2023, he said, addressing the room, after 16 months of independent verification. She didn't come to us immediately because she needed time to ensure her documentation was complete and verifiable." He paused, and I saw him glance at Silas. She waited because she needed to protect her son. The ballroom was so quiet, I could hear someone's watch ticking 3 tables away. "I didn't act immediately," I said, taking the microphone Merritt offered, because I needed enough evidence to prove Silas didn't know. The offshore accounts, the shell companies, the signatures on documents he'd never seen. I needed to show that my son had been used, that he'd signed papers without understanding what they were, that he'd trusted the wrong people, that he was a victim, not a criminal. I looked at Silas. I waited until I could save him. My son stood 20 feet away from me, the man who'd whispered, "Mom, please leave," an hour ago. And I watched him understand that while he was choosing Celeste over me, I was choosing him over everything. My pride, my anger, even my right to speak the truth. The moment I discovered it, I'd stayed silent for 16 months, documenting every invoice, every transfer, every lie. Because speaking too soon would have meant federal prosecutors looking at those offshore accounts and seeing my son's name without seeing the full picture of how it got there. Silas's face went pale. Not the pale of embarrassment, the pale of someone realizing their mother had just taken a bullet meant for them. Dagny closed her notebook. Mrs. Warren's timeline matches our investigation. The first fraudulent transaction we verified occurred in March 2019. The most recent was deposited 4 days ago, Monday, September 25th, 2023. 4 days ago. While Celeste and Silas were finalizing the guest list for tonight's party, someone had transferred stolen money into an account in Singapore. I looked across the ballroom at Preston Whitmore. He stood at the head table, silver-haired and perfectly still. But something had changed in his face. The confidence was gone. The polished smile had cracked. He looked like a man who'd just realized he was standing on a bridge that had already started to collapse. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. His fingers moved across the screen fast, practiced the movements of someone who'd done this exact thing before. I watched him type something, 5 words, maybe 6. Then he hit send and set the phone face down on the white tablecloth. Dagny Thornton was beside him in 4 steps. She placed her hand firmly on his shoulder, not aggressive, just present. The kind of touch that says, "Don't move, and I mean it." "Mr. Whitmore," she said calmly, "your server room at the Whitmore Foundation building has been under federal seal since 6 o'clock this evening." Preston's hand froze above his phone. Any attempt to remotely access, modify, or delete data from that server will be flagged and documented as obstruction of justice. Merritt Blackwell walked to the head table, standing on Preston's other side. Our forensic team made a complete backup of your accounting database at 4:30 this afternoon, Merritt said. Every file, every transaction, every deleted email recovered from your backup servers. The original data is already with the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York. 4:30 in the afternoon. The forensic team had already won before Preston ever poured his first glass of champagne, before the first guest arrived, before Celeste stood beside the 5-tier cake and asked, "Who let you in?" Before Silas whispered, "Mom, please leave." The trap had been set hours ago, and Preston had walked straight into it, wearing a designer suit and a smile that said he'd never lose. Preston looked at his phone lying face down on the table. Whatever message he'd sent, execute Protocol 7, wipe server alpha, delete all records, whatever coded instruction he'd been so confident would erase the evidence, it had already executed, and it had changed absolutely nothing. I watched him realize it. The way his jaw tightened, the way his shoulders dropped half an inch, the way his eyes moved from Dagny to Merritt to the federal agents standing near the entrance, blocking every exit. The deletion attempt was logged at 9:34 p.m., Dagny said quietly. It will be included in the federal indictment. Preston Whitmore set his phone down on the white tablecloth beside his untouched wine glass. His shoulders sagged. The polished smile he'd worn for 40 years, the smile that had convinced investors, charmed donors, intimidated accountants, built an empire on reputation and lies, was gone. For the first time since I'd walked into that ballroom, he looked exactly like what he was, a 65-year-old man who'd just lost everything. The foundation, the money, the reputation, the carefully constructed story that he was a philanthropist instead of a thief. He looked old, not distinguished, not powerful, just old. And then from the table beside him, Stella Whitmore stood up. Stella Whitmore stood from her chair beside her husband and reached into her small silver evening purse. And when she pulled out an old iPhone instead of a handkerchief or lipstick, I saw Preston's face change from defeat to something worse. Recognition. She walked toward Dagny Thornton with the kind of calm I'd only seen in people who'd made a decision weeks ago and were finally, mercifully, allowed to execute it. Her heels clicked on the marble floor. She didn't look at Preston. She didn't look at Celeste. She didn't look at the 300 guests watching her cross the ballroom with a phone in her hand. She looked only at the federal agent. "Agent Thornton," Stella said, her voice steady. "I have recordings." She held out the iPhone. 31 of them. The oldest is from 2019. The ballroom went silent, in a way it hadn't been all night. This wasn't the silence of shock or horror or scandal. This was the silence of people watching a woman they'd known for 30 years reveal she'd been someone else the entire time. Dagny took the phone, carefully holding it like evidence, which it was. "Stella." Preston's voice came from the head table, strangled, gasping. Stella didn't turn. "I recorded them," she said to Dagny, her words precise and measured. "Because I was afraid my husband would blame me next, Agent. Not because I'm brave, because I'm not stupid." She said it the way someone states a fact they've verified. The sky is blue, water is wet. Preston Whitmore throws people under buses to save himself, and I refuse to be next. Dagny handed the phone to one of the other federal agents, who immediately began examining it. "These recordings," Stella continued, "include conversations between my husband and his daughter about the offshore accounts, the shell companies, and their plans to frame Silas Warren if federal investigators ever got too close." I looked at Stella Whitmore, 62 years old, standing in a burgundy evening gown beside federal agents handing over evidence against her own husband, and I understood that silence is not always acceptance. Sometimes it's someone counting down, waiting for the moment when saving yourself becomes more important than protecting someone else. She'd sat at that head table tonight. She'd smiled at guests. She'd raised her wine glass during toasts. And the entire time, she'd been carrying an old iPhone with 31 recordings that would destroy everything Preston had built. Not because she was good, because she was smart. "Mrs. Whitmore," Dagny said, "these recordings will need to be authenticated and verified. Are you willing to provide testimony regarding when and where they were made?" "Yes," Stella said. "I have detailed notes, dates, times, locations. I kept a separate record." Of course she did. The federal agent examining the phone looked up. "Agent Thornton, the files are labeled and dated. The metadata appears intact." Dagny nodded. She took the phone back, connected it to a small portable speaker one of the agents produced from a briefcase, and scrolled through the files. "This one," Stella said, quietly pointing to a file dated August 14th, 2023, 2 months ago. Preston's office. Dagny pressed play. The sound quality was surprisingly clear. Preston's voice came through the speaker first, measured and calculated. "If this blows up, Silas takes the fall. That's the whole point of him." A pause. Then Celeste's voice younger, sharper. "He won't see it coming. He never does." Preston again. "The offshore accounts are all in his name. The Singapore holding company lists him as managing director. If federal prosecutors come knocking, they'll see his signatures on everything." "That's why I chose him," Celeste said, and I heard something in her voice I'd never heard before. Not affection, not even pretense, just cold assessment. "He signs everything I put in front of him without reading it. His mother cleans offices for a living, so if he gets arrested, she can't afford a real lawyer. It's perfect." It's perfect. That's what she'd said. My son's life designed as a trap from the very first signature, and she'd called it perfect. The recording continued. "What about his mother?" Preston's voice asked. "She's been working in the building for years." "She's a cleaning lady," Celeste said, dismissive. "She empties trash and vacuums floors. Even if she saw something, who would believe her? And Silas would never believe his own mother over me." The recording ended. The ballroom was silent. I looked at my son. Silas stood near the bar where I'd handed him the wrapped gift an hour ago, the pocket watch that had belonged to his grandfather. The gift he'd set down without opening, because acknowledging me in front of Celeste's family wasn't worth the cost. His face was white. Not pale. White. The color of someone who just heard their entire marriage dissected like a biology experiment. Every moment of trust revealed as calculation. Every "I love you" exposed as strategy. He'd married Celeste Whitmore because she was beautiful and confident and came from money and made him feel like he was finally welcome somewhere. And she'd married him because his mother was poor, because I cleaned offices, because she knew that if her plan fell apart, I wouldn't be able to save him. She'd weaponized my poverty against my own son. Celeste stood beside the 5-tier cake, still wearing her ivory silk dress, still looking like something from a wedding magazine. But the performance was over. The mask had cracked. She looked at me first, not with hatred, with assessment, like she was calculating whether I was a threat or just collateral damage. Then she looked at Silas. Then her eyes moved toward the fire exit near the kitchen entrance, the one the staff used to bring in catering supplies. Her gaze was sharp, searching, measuring the distance between where she stood and the door. But federal agents were already there, 2 of them standing with their hands clasped in front of them, blocking the exit. I looked around the ballroom and saw agents at every door, the main entrance where Merritt had walked, in the service hallway, even the staff corridor near the stage. They'd been positioned there since the beginning, since before Celeste asked, "Who let you in?" Since before Preston tried to delete the server. Every exit was blocked. Celeste Whitmore had nowhere left to run. Special Agent Dagny Thornton's voice cut through the ballroom with the calm precision of someone who'd done this 100 times. "Preston Whitmore, Celeste Whitmore, you are under arrest for wire fraud in violation of 18 U.S.C. Section 1343, money laundering in violation of 18 U.S.C. Section 1956, and charitable fraud." She pulled 2 warrant documents from her briefcase. These warrants were issued this afternoon by the U.S. District Court for the Southern District of New York. Preston stood frozen at the head table. Celeste stood beside the 5-tier cake, her ivory silk dress suddenly looking like a costume she couldn't take off. 2 federal agents stepped forward, not rushing, not dramatic, just professional. One approached Preston, one approached Celeste. The agent near Preston spoke first, reading from a small card. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you. Do you understand these rights?" Preston's face went red. "I want my lawyer," he said, voice tight. "Now." The agent nodded. "You'll be able to contact your attorney from the precinct, sir. We're requesting that you accompany us voluntarily. No handcuffs, no hands pushed behind backs, no theatrical perp walk. Just 2 federal agents standing beside 2 people who'd stolen from dying children, speaking in calm, measured tones, making it clear that this wasn't a request, despite being phrased like one." I watched Preston realize what was happening. Not the arrest itself, he'd probably known that was inevitable the moment Merritt walked through the doors, but the reality. The fact that arguing wouldn't help. The fact that 300 witnesses had just watched federal agents read him his Miranda rights. The agent beside Celeste repeated the same warning. Celeste said nothing. She didn't demand a lawyer. She didn't protest. She just stood there looking at the federal agent the way someone looks at a parking ticket they know they can't fight. Dagny gestured to 2 other agents. "We also have warrants for Thomas Mercer and David Caldwell, both employed as fund managers at the Whitmore Foundation." 2 men near the back guests I'd seen earlier holding champagne glasses went pale. The agents approached them with the same professional calm, reading the same Miranda rights. 4 arrests. 4 people who'd spent years stealing from families who couldn't fight back. And every arrest delivered with the kind of cold professionalism that made it feel more real than any shouting or handcuffs ever could. This was how justice actually worked. Not dramatic, not satisfying in the way movies made you expect, just inevitable. The agents escorted Preston toward the main entrance. He walked with his shoulders back, trying to maintain dignity he'd already lost. Celeste was escorted past the bar where Silas stood. She didn't look at him. He didn't look at her. 4 years of marriage, and when she walked past him toward federal custody, neither acknowledged the other's existence. The 5-tier cake stood on the stage like a monument to everything's stolen white frosting hiding dark money, sugar roses covering children's tears, a celebration paid for with other people's suffering. $380,000 baked into fondant and buttercream, and it would never be cut. It would sit there until the catering staff threw it away, untouched, perfect, expensive, and completely wasted. The ballroom had gone silent again. Not shocked silence. This was the silence of people who didn't know whether to leave or stay, whether this was still a party or a crime scene. I stood near the bar, my small purse still in my hand, my blue dress still the same one I'd worn for 8 years. And then I heard footsteps. Silas walked toward me across the empty dance floor. Not the confident walk of a man who belonged here, the slow, uncertain walk of someone whose entire world had just collapsed. He stopped 3 feet away. Then his knees buckled, not theatrically. His legs just couldn't support his weight anymore, and he sank to the red carpet, his hands braced on the floor, his head down. "Mom," he said, his voice breaking, "I'm sorry." 2 words I've been waiting to hear for 4 years. I looked down at my son kneeling on the floor of a ballroom he could no longer afford, wearing a suit he'd probably have to sell, married to a woman, being escorted to federal custody for framing him as a criminal. I didn't rush to embrace him. I didn't tell him it was okay. I didn't absolve him with instant maternal forgiveness that erases consequences and pretends pain never happened. I reached down and placed my hand on his head, the same way I'd done when he was 7 years old with a fever when I'd sat beside his bed all night. The same way I'd done when he was 12 and his father died. The same way I'd done 1,000 times when he was young and scared and needed to know his mother was there. I felt his hair under my palm thinner than when he was 7, gray at the temples now. But in that moment, kneeling on a red carpet he could no longer afford, he was just my boy again. "Get up, Silas," I said quietly. "We have work to do." Not, "I forgive you." Not, "It's okay." Not, "You're absolved." Just get up. Because forgiveness isn't a gift you hand someone. It's something they earn by standing up and doing the work to deserve it. He stood slowly, his eyes bloodshot and rimmed with red, his designer suit wrinkled from kneeling. And for the first time since he'd stepped into the world of the Whitmores 4 years ago, the world of polished smiles and signed papers and choosing comfort over truth, he looked like the boy I had raised. The boy who used to wait for me by the door. The boy I'd been fighting to save all along. The federal indictments came down on November 3rd, 2023, 5 weeks after the anniversary party that ended with arrests instead of champagne toasts. And I learned about them the same way everyone else did, watching the news in my Queens apartment while folding laundry I'd washed by hand. The television showed Preston Whitmore walking into the federal courthouse, flanked by 3 lawyers in suits that cost more than my yearly salary. The ticker at the bottom of the screen read, Whitmore Foundation fraud, 18 counts. Wire fraud, 12 counts. Money laundering, conspiracy to defraud charitable organization. Celeste appeared on screen next wearing a navy blazer and pearl earrings, looking every bit like someone attending a business meeting instead of a federal arraignment. The legal machinery moved the way it always does. Cold, precise, inevitable. Assets frozen. Foundation placed under court receivership. Bank accounts seized. The Whitmore family lawyers filed motions that were denied. They requested bail that was granted with conditions. They tried to suppress evidence that federal judges ruled admissible. And through it all, my son cooperated with prosecutors. Silas Warren, listed on paper as managing director of 3 offshore shell companies he'd never heard of, sat in conference rooms with federal attorneys and told them the truth. He'd signed everything Celeste put in front of him without reading a single page. He'd trusted his wife. He'd been used. The prosecutors cleared him in mid-November. Unwitting nominee, they called it in the legal documents. A pawn, not a player. But clearing him didn't give him back what he'd lost. His title at the foundation gone. His salary gone. The penthouse apartment in his name that was actually paid for with stolen money, seized by federal asset forfeiture. His marriage annulled by a lawyer Merritt Blackwell helped him find a man who worked pro bono for people Celeste Whitmore had tried to destroy. My son lost everything except his freedom and his name. The prosecutor handling the asset recovery called me into her office in late November. She was professional, efficient, and she explained something called the Federal Fraud Whistleblower Reward Program. Mrs. Warren, you're entitled to receive a percentage of the recovered funds, she said, sliding a document across her desk. Given the amount involved, we're looking at potentially several $1 million. I looked at the number on the page. It had 7 digits. I said, no. The prosecutor blinked. I'm sorry. Send it to the hospitals, I said. Send it to the families who lost loved ones because treatment funds were stolen. Send it to the pediatric cancer wards. Every dollar. I don't want any of it. She stared at me for a long moment. Mrs. Warren, this is money you've legally earned. You took significant personal risk to document this fraud. And I did it because the numbers were wrong, I said. Not because I wanted to get rich. The money belongs to the people it was stolen from. Make sure they get it. I signed a form declining the reward. 7 figures I'd never see. 7 figures I didn't need to see. Because some things aren't about money. My son moved back to Queens, the borough he'd spent 4 years trying to escape, the place he'd been ashamed to mention at corporate dinners, and rented a room with a window that looked at a brick wall 3 blocks from the apartment where I'd raised him alone. He didn't ask to stay with me, and I didn't invite him. It was the first step of genuine honesty between us. No pretending, no shortcuts, no maternal forgiveness that erased consequences. Just 2 people rebuilding a relationship from the foundation up, one honest conversation at a time. Silas found work volunteering at a Queens nonprofit that helped families navigate medical debt. Unpaid, 40 hours a week. He wore jeans instead of designer suits and learned to make coffee in a break room instead of ordering it from assistants. We met for breakfast every Sunday at Corner Cafe Astoria. The 3rd consecutive Sunday over eggs and toast that cost $4 instead of $40. He asked the question I'd been waiting for. Mom, why didn't you tell me earlier? About Celeste? About the money? If you knew for 18 months, why didn't you warn me? I set down my coffee cup. Because you would have chosen her, I said. And I needed you to see it for yourself. His face went pale. You think I wouldn't have believed you? I know you wouldn't have. You loved her. You wanted a place in that family. If I'd told you your wife was framing you for fraud, you would have thought I was jealous. You would have thought I didn't understand. You would have chosen her over me, and then, when it all came down, you'd have had no one. I reached across the table and put my hand over his. I waited, I said, until I had enough evidence that even you couldn't deny it, even when she was standing right there telling you I was wrong. He was quiet for a long time. I'm sorry, he finally said. I know. That's why we're here. In early December, Merritt Blackwell called me into his Midtown office. I'm expanding my fraud detection consulting practice, he said. I need someone who can look at financial documents and see what accountants miss. Someone who understands that numbers tell stories if you know how to read them. He slid a contract across his desk. $85,000 per year, part-time, remote work, fraud detection advisor. You'd review case files, flag irregularities, help my legal team understand what they're looking at. I stared at the number. $85,000. More than I'd earned in any 2 years combined cleaning offices. You're offering me this because of what I found, I said. I'm offering you this because you're good at it, Merritt said. Better than people with degrees and certifications. You see what's wrong because you care when things don't add up. That's not a skill you can teach. He stood at the doorway as I read the contract. Were you ever afraid? He asked quietly. Every single day, I said. But fear doesn't make something wrong. I signed the contract. If you've ever spent your whole life being paid less than you're worth, you know what it feels like when someone finally offers you what you deserve. It doesn't feel like victory. It feels like grief for all the years you lost. I walked out of Merritt's Midtown building and took the subway back to Queens. I didn't hail a cab. I didn't need to. I just wanted to sit in the train car and watch the city glide past the glass. The city I had cleaned for 30 years, scrubbing floors and buildings where I'd never been invited through the front door. And for the very first time, feel like I belonged to it. Like it belonged to me. The blue dress went back on for the hospital ceremony in December, the same one I'd worn to the anniversary party in September. Pressing the iron across the collar that morning in my Queens apartment, I thought about how much lighter it felt the second time. The Manhattan Children's Medical Center held the ceremony in a ground-floor auditorium, not the kind with velvet seats and acoustic paneling, but the kind with plastic chairs arranged in rows and fluorescent lights that hummed overhead. 60 people filled the room. Sick children, parents who looked like they hadn't slept in weeks, nurses in scrubs, a hospital administrator in a sensible gray suit. No crystal chandeliers, no 5-tier cake, no champagne glasses or string quartets or guests wearing designer gowns that cost more than a year of chemotherapy. Just people who understood exactly what $2.1 million meant when it went to the right place instead of being stolen. Silas sat beside me in the second row. He'd taken the morning off from his volunteer work to be here. He wore a plain button-down shirt and khakis, not the tailored suits from his Whitmore Foundation days, but clothes that fit a man learning to live within his means. The hospital director stood at a small podium and read from prepared remarks. Today marks the completion of fund restitution from the Whitmore Foundation fraud case. $2.1 million has been returned to pediatric cancer treatment accounts, emergency medical assistance programs, and directly to 43 families whose treatment costs were denied or delayed due to fraudulent fund diversion. He paused, looking out at the audience. This recovery would not have been possible without the courage of one person, someone who saw numbers that didn't add up and chose to act, someone who spent 18 months documenting fraud, while the rest of us went about our lives not knowing children were suffering because money meant for their care was being stolen. He looked directly at me. Maxine Warren, whose courage and 18 months of meticulous documentation brought justice to children who couldn't fight for themselves. The room stood. 60 people, parents holding the hands of children with IV ports still visible under their sleeves, nurses who'd watched kids die waiting for treatments they couldn't access, families who'd sold their homes to pay for care that should have been funded by the foundation, rose to their feet and applauded. Not polite charity gala applause. Not the kind of clapping you do because everyone else is doing it. Real applause. The kind that comes from people who know the difference between a speech and a life saved. I stood slowly and nodded. I didn't wave. I didn't smile like I'd won something. I just acknowledged that I'd heard them, that I understood what this moment meant. If you've ever wondered what it feels like to be invited somewhere you actually belong, let me tell you, it doesn't look like crystal chandeliers and 5-tier cakes. It looks like a hospital auditorium with plastic chairs and a child who drew your picture in crayon. After the ceremony, families came forward to speak with the hospital staff about treatment schedules and fund access. I stood near the back, ready to leave, when I felt a small hand tug on my sleeve. Lily Fisher, 8 years old, with thin hair from chemotherapy and a medical mask covering half her small face, walked toward me holding a piece of paper she'd drawn in the hospital playroom. She held it out without saying anything. I took it carefully. The drawing showed an old woman in a blue dress standing in what looked like an office, holding a tiny blue notebook. Stick figure style drawn in crayon, with the careful detail only children use when they're trying to get something exactly right. At the bottom, in letters that took up half the page, she'd written, "Thank you for fitting for us." I looked at the paper, an old woman in a blue dress holding a tiny notebook drawn in crayon by a child who understood more about justice than the Whitmores ever would. "Thank you, Lily," I said quietly. She nodded and walked back to her mother, who was crying silently near the doorway. I held the drawing in both hands and thought about the journey from that night in March 2022, standing in the chief accountant's office at midnight, staring at an invoice for $340,000 that had no delivery address, to this moment, in December 2023, holding a picture drawn by a child whose treatment was now funded by money that had finally reached the right hands. Celeste Whitmore had once asked me, "Who let you in?" Like I'd crashed a party I had no right to attend. Like I was a poor woman climbing too high, reaching for tables I didn't belong at. Perhaps she was right. Perhaps I did climb too high, but not to get a seat at their banquet table. I climbed into this room with these children, with these families who'd lost everything except hope. I climbed with a 99-cent notebook and 18 months of careful handwriting, and the belief that numbers don't lie, even when people do. The 5-tier wedding anniversary cake had stood untouched on a stage in September. $380,000 of stolen funds from cancer-stricken children baked into fondant and buttercream, never cut, never tasted, abandoned when federal agents walked through the doors. It sat there for hours while Preston and Celeste were arrested, a monument to everything they'd valued: appearance over substance, celebration over compassion, their own comfort over children's lives. That cake was thrown away. But $2.1 million reached the treatment accounts, reached the hospitals, reached the families. And that, I realized, was the truest gift the Whitmore marriage ever gave, even though none of them remained to witness it. I looked down at Lily's drawing one more time. An old woman in a blue dress holding a notebook, fighting for us. I thought about Celeste's question from that night in September. Who let you in? Nobody let me in here. I didn't need an invitation. I walked through these doors because I'd earned it, because I'd fought for it, because for once in my 67 years, I belonged at a table, not because someone allowed me to sit down, but because I built the table myself. And that finally was enough. To everyone listening to my story, please hold on to what I'm about to say. For 18 months, I documented fraud in complete silence, all while watching my son drift closer to the Whitmore family and further away from me. Looking back now, the waiting was the most painful part of everything. I watched him sign documents he never once stopped to read. I watched my poverty be twisted into a weapon used against him, against us. Please don't repeat my mistake of staying silent for too long. But equally important, don't speak before you are ready, before you have gathered enough evidence to truly protect the people you love most. If you are currently navigating family conflict where someone has looked down on you because of your background, your financial situation, or the work you do, then hear me clearly. Your value is not defined by their opinion of you. Stories like mine, where a mother fights back against injustice, are never simply about revenge. They are about finding the strength to stand tall when everything and everyone around you is telling you to sit down and stay quiet. I genuinely believe that God placed that very first invoice in front of me for a reason far greater than I understood at the time. Sometimes, the most powerful truths are carried in the quietest voices and the smallest, most ordinary notebooks. You do not need wealth. You do not need social status or powerful connections. All you need is courage, patience, and an unwillingness to let the truth be buried. So I want to ask you, have you ever been in a situation where you had to fight hard just to protect your dignity within your own family? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story moved something inside you, please pass it along to someone who may need to hear it. And if you want to hear more stories about mothers who refuse to back down, make sure you subscribe to Silent Revenge with Auntie May. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for staying with me until the very end. Your time is something I never take for granted. Please note, this story contains fictionalized elements crafted for narrative and emotional purposes. Any resemblance to real individuals or actual events is entirely coincidental. My deepest hope is that the message stays with you that truth, patience, and quiet courage can overcome even the most carefully constructed deception.